When it comes to attracting a wide audience for your game, one of the more important aspects when figuring out your core gameplay loop is understanding what the skill floor and skill ceiling of your game is going to be. So for today's critical thought, we're going to be discussing what these baselines and top lines mean and why you need to approach your game or every game differently in this respect. A popular question that I like to ask developers when we have them on for our developer interviews is what kind of skill level they're building their game around. Is it for casual players, advanced, expert, so on and so forth? And while it may not sound like an important question, it is something you really need to consider when you're figuring out the core audience of your game, and something that we've discussed before when it comes to the baseline experience. Another way to describe this would be the skill floor of your title. And what that means is the absolute bare minimum requirement in order to be able to play this game. Are you trying to build this game for somebody who's never pressed a jump button before? Someone who's never played an FPS? Or are you trying to build this for Kaizo fans? People who found Doom Eternal on Ultra Nightmare to be too easy, and so on and so forth. And these kinds of discussions are going to be kind of filtered through your core gameplay loop. This is not something you're going to have even before you even come up with a concept for a game. This is once you figure out what kind of game you want to make, who is the intended audience for it? And the reason why this is important is that one of the major aspects of how game design has changed over the past 10 to 15 years has been trying to reach as wide of an audience as you reasonably can. And that means understanding what aspects are going to stop people from enjoying your game and what are the reasons why somebody's going to play your game in the first place. You could have somebody who wants to play your brutally difficult platformer because they just like the art. You can have somebody who wants to play a game because they just want to see the story. And it's important when you are figuring out the baseline experience of your game to get that as low as possible. Now, with that said, the baseline is the minimum. This is the absolute, middle of the road kind of design that you want your game to appeal to. You should not design your baseline to either be ultra difficult or incredibly easy. And one of the things that we see from developers who kind of get what it means to design a game in the respective genres is that they will typically try and build it around one singular difficulty experience. This is something that we see from the Souls-likes, from platformers, from even some of the FPSs that we've played. And the reason why you want to keep difficulty settings as minimal as possible is that you want to build, balance, and test your game around that baseline. You want to make sure that if this is the bar of your skill floor, that everything in your game is designed to facilitate someone to enjoy the game at this level. If you design your game around being the super hardcore, yes, you are going to attract those people, but at the same time, you're also going to limit your audience from people who either can't get to that level or just are completely put off by the demand of it. And it is incredibly hard to maintain the skill floor and the skill ceiling of a game, as you want to continue to escalate in terms of how a game goes on. Now, as we've talked about before, this is not the same as saying if level 3 is a 3 out of 10, level 5 should be a 5 out of 10. There are creative ways of providing variety and challenge to a game beyond just upping everything, and conversely, there are ways of making a game easier without just saying everybody does 50% less damage. And a good example of trying to get to that baseline and sticking to it would be Doom Eternal. When we played Doom Eternal on stream, I was playing that on Nightmare difficulty, which is the hardest, not counting Ultra Nightmares, Iron Man, one life mode. And what it did in Doom Eternal was every difficulty setting does not change the overall appearance or design of a level. You're not going to get completely redesigned levels going from easy to nightmare. Likewise, enemy encounters remain fixed, regardless of what difficulty you play on. And that's a very important point. When you play Doom Eternal, whether you are on easy or nightmare, you are getting the same exact experience. The same one that's been play tested, the same skill floor, and the same skill ceiling. What the difficulties do is they limit your ability to make mistakes. As you go up in difficulty, the enemies become more aggressive, they're a lot more able to do damage to you. But you're still going to fight the same enemies in the same spots, use the same weapons, use the same tactics. And in this regard, it's a great way of training the player to improve their skill and maybe increase the difficulty if they see fit. And if they're in trouble, they can lower the difficulty. And you see, that's a very important point when we talk about skill curves in game design. It's not about always making the game incredibly easy or making things frustratingly difficult. It is about offering the player choice. That, again, if this is my skill floor, this is my baseline experience, and if you're in trouble, we can offer ways to make it a little bit easier for you. If you want more challenge, if you find the game boring, we can find ways of making it more difficult. And these ways have to, again, be factored and filtered through your core gameplay loop and your baseline. You do not want your baseline experience to have problems. And this is something that I think we see from games that tend to mess up with this. That they will put in frustrating elements, and instead of fixing it, they may just go for difficulty settings or assist modes or anything that can remove those pain points, but still leave them in on that baseline point of view. This was an issue that I ran into when we played Young Souls. That in Young Souls, your character cannot kind of animation cancel when they're blocking or when they're swinging a weapon. And it leads to a lot of the heavier weapons being heavily punished and almost unplayable on the highest difficulties. So if you look in the menu options, you can turn on block, I believe it's block and swing animation canceling, which, because of how the game was designed from its baseline, could very well break the game very easily if you turn that on or disable that feature and use those heavy weapons when you can just swing, block, swing, block, swing, block, and there's no penalty for it. But you need to design, again, your baseline should be your game at its most enjoyable for as wide of an audience as you can. You do not want to hide fixes or have toggles in your option menu or your assist mode. Because one thing that we see from a lot of titles is that given the choice of digging through menus or turning on and off features, a lot of people just are going to quit the game and say, I don't want to play this game anymore. And we see this when we looked at the churn rates on our show. What was it? I completely forget the name. It's been a while. Completion Critiques. There we go. And how even with games that have a lot of difficulty settings, a lot of assist modes, they will often go from 100% player rate to 65 to 33 to 10. And that's in the span of an hour to an hour and a half, sometimes even less than that. Now, there is, of course, more to discuss about this. For instance, Doom Eternal has a pretty good completion rate and very low churn rate. It's not as spiky, but it's still a very challenging game. And this is another thing you have to understand about getting the baseline experience right. Because this is what you're going to market and show people about your title. And you need to be careful when it comes to how your game is being portrayed. If you're saying your game is supposed to be fair for everyone, and then almost in the first 5 minutes, there's a Kaizo, Elden Ring late game boss fight, people are going to feel that you've lied about your game. And conversely, if you're pitching this game as brutally difficult, incredibly challenging for the expert players, and the first hour is just making simple jumps or simple gameplay mechanics, people are going to be justifiably annoyed with you. And this is why we've seen over the last 4 to 5 years this idea of letting players kind of pick and choose how they want to adjust a game. That again, the developer's role is to get that baseline as perfectly as they can. Because once you know and once you have that done, you can then start to look at ways of raising or lowering the difficulty curve. And I want to talk more about this and kind of the right and wrong ways of using assist modes, progressive difficulties, and so on. But we're going to take a quick break. And as always, if you're interested in my thoughts on design, then check out my game design books. For entry-level students, we have 20 Essential Games to Study, and then the Game Design Deep Dive series that takes an extensive look at different genres, with free-to-play coming in 2022. One of the main reasons why it's important to understand the baseline as well as the skill ceiling of your game is that this then allows you to figure out ways of adjusting the difficulty and again improve the approachability and the UX of your title. And as I said at the end of the last part, we've seen developers have creative ways of doing this beyond just blanket or checking off every aspect in terms of difficulty settings. And that is often something that we see from developers when they're not quite sure, they're having trouble figuring out why people aren't playing their games. There's led to a whole discussion about having either the story mode as super easy, or just increasing the difficulty to masochistic levels on the very hardest setting. And when we see games that again go for super extremes in terms of their difficulty and their experience, they oftentimes end up not feeling that well. And most importantly, they oftentimes have issues at their baseline, where just playing the game normally could be frustrating, it could be boring, or it could just be something that there's obvious issues that have been left in or missed that are just going to annoy people, and again, they're not going to want to try and fix your game for you. So, one of the things that we've seen again over the last 5 to 7 years has been figuring out ways of allowing everyone to pick and choose how to improve the difficulty of their game. And again, when we talk about difficulty and approachability in this respect, it's not about just making the game easier. Because this is again where a lot of developers, and I think people looking from the outside in, tend to focus on. How do we always make the game easier? How do we remove challenge? But you should also be thinking about ways of adding challenge. How can we make this game more interesting or offer more of a bite? And the reason why you want to do this is that when you think about these aspects, you can add them to the difficulty settings, to other ways. You don't want to, again, make your baseline as easy or as hard of your game as possible. You want that to be right in the middle. So, some really good examples that we've seen. One of them out of the deck building roguelike genre, or just kind of the more, I guess, non-traditional roguelikes, has been the use of progressive difficulty. This is something that we saw with Slay the Spire, Monster Train, Inscription, even stuff like Hades as well. Where, as you beat the game, beating the game on, let's say, progressive difficulty 0 is right at that baseline. For somebody new playing the game, it can offer a challenge. For somebody who's an expert, it's a vacation. Like when we play Gunfire Reborn as well. But every time you beat the game, you can raise the difficulty up, you can tweak it. And as you tweak the difficulty, you're not changing all aspects of your game. You're trying to focus on specific areas that you can make the game more interesting. But at the same time, this is stuff that if you are a newcomer or someone just learning the game, would be a little too much for you to handle. In Monster Train, which I think had 25 different, Ascension or progressive difficulty options, playing on level 0 is a bit of a challenge when you start. But it is nothing like playing on progressive level, I think it was like 24 or 25, when you now get bonus junk cards, All the enemies have higher stats, it's harder to buy stuff in your stores, and there's even more conditionals on top of conditionals, and it does feel like an entirely different game. And that's the point, that as a player, you have the freedom to decide how high you want to push it. For some people, they beat the game on level 0, they're done. I beat the game, uninstall, have my fun, move on to the next. Somebody else will say, you know what, I want to keep going for challenge. Let's go to 5 and 10 and 20. And can we beat this game with every different setting on? But you see, here's the point and why getting this baseline is so important. Player A and player B are both getting a fulfilling experience. It's just that each player has their own concept as to what they want to get out of this game. Again, your baseline should be able to be appreciated and approached by as many people as you can. You want to see as many people who buy your game that can play it and maybe beat it. But when you have those additional challenges or those additional affordances that allow somebody to improve or adjust the game, it means that more people can enjoy it. So that if I want to play this game on the highest possible difficulty, and you want to play on the absolute lowest, or with all the additional approachability and assist features on, we're both still enjoying this game. How I play the game has no relation to how you play the game, and vice versa. And that's something I think a lot of people tend to forget when we talk about these discussions on approachability and UX design. That if someone in Elden Ring wants to summon for every fight and use spellcasting and summons the ashes as well and use all the best weapons, they can do that. If someone wants to run around in a loincloth with a club and just beat up enemies with no spells and whatnot, they can do that as well. And this is why, again, that when we see games that offer a wide approach, not just in terms of making the game easier, but making them harder, that people are generally more accommodating or more willing to keep playing those games and keep trying to learn them. Now, does that mean that Elden Ring and games like it have perfect approachability? No. We can certainly still see high churn rates in those titles. And again, Elden Ring's approachability and design is a lot different than your approachability and design if you're working on any kind of indie game and watching this video. Now, when you're looking at trying to adjust aspects, so another example of game I always like to talk about when it comes to figuring out different ways or approachability aspects is Way of the Passive Fist. This is a title that allows you to tweak every aspect of its mechanics and its systems to make them either easier or harder. And again, if you want to play this game at the baseline, that is middle of the road, you do not change anything. But if you find certain aspects of the game harder, or you want certain aspects to be either more challenging or less challenging, you can tweak the game how you see fit. But again, when you are coming up with how you want people to play your game, you need to establish that normal or difficulty level 3 or whatever how you want to describe it, that is the intended way of playing this game. This is what developer has spent the most time playtesting. This is how they expect you to play this title. And then you can offer players options to either, again, lower or raise that at their own accord. Again, when people are adjusting difficulty and challenge no matter what, you do not want to actively punish or reward them for it. And when we say that, what I mean is that the game should not go out of its way to either praise or chastise the player based on how they want to play it. And again, this is definitely one of those changes that we saw from 90s game design to where we're at today. If you want to have super expert, masochistically difficult challenges for achievements, you can do that. But if somebody wants to play your game on normal mode or an easy mode, they should at least still be able to get a beat the game achievement or, complete this. And you do not want to restrict or remove content based on the player's difficulty choices. There's a difference between saying, like in an ARPG, for instance, that if you play on the highest difficulty, there's a greater magic drop chance or rare item drop chance, versus saying, if you don't play the game on at least this difficulty or above, you can't see the entire game. This was a problem that Cuphead ran into, where if you wanted to just play the game on the easiest setting, you couldn't actually finish the game with the final 2 fights. And that was definitely a major UX problem. And one of the things that, again, that we can often see, or the kind of goal of having your baseline then elements either below or higher than it, is that if somebody really does enjoy your game, they may want to bump up the difficulty. They may want to add more challenge. But that's only after they've figured out kind of how this game works. So for those of you watching this, here's a question. Can you think of a game that you played, that you started on one of the lower difficulty settings, or just started on normal, and then through playing the game and enjoying it, it made you want to play it on the higher settings? And if you did that, did you enjoy the game with the greater challenge? Let me know in the comments down below. But to wrap things up, your baseline or your skill floor is the absolute minimal level of skill and kind of understanding that you expect someone to bring into the genre. Even with that said, you still should be designing your game from a UI UX perspective for people who've never touched that genre before. Because remember, every game is somebody's first. And you can, when you make these changes, it can improve things for everyone. Even people who didn't think there was an issue or a problem before, they may appreciate your added UX elements or making the game more streamlined. But this is something that you need to consider as you're building your title. Who is my intended audience, and what kind of skill level am I expecting people to have? Because again, there's nothing wrong with designing a game meant for casual players, just as there's nothing wrong with designing a game for the super hardcore. But it's how you market and position that game. And remember, you can always add or remove elements to change the difficulty. But whatever you decide your baseline is going to be, that is your intended audience. And if your intended audience expects a game to be either on the easier side or on the harder side, you want to make sure your baseline is as close to that as possible. And then you can start to come up with ways, again, to adjust things further if the player wants to do it. Because you don't want to force someone to play the game on an easier setting or on a harder setting. You want them to want to make that choice themselves. So with that said, thank you so much for watching today's Critical Thought. Do the liking, subscribing, and commenting as always. Check out our Discord and Patreon link down below. And come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where I examine the art and science of games. Until next time, take care.